Jake had always known the value of hard work. From the moment he was old enough to carry a shovel, his father had him working on the ranch. There were no shortcuts, no easy days. Every sunrise was another day to toil in the fields, care for the cattle, and mend the fences. But it wasn't just work. It was love, a connection to the land his family had cultivated for generations. The ranch had been passed down from his grandfather to his father, and now it was Jake's turn to carry that legacy forward. It was more than just dirt and crops. It was history. It was family. It was home. Jake had always dreamed of the future he would build on that land. He imagined raising a family of his own, teaching his children the same values his father had instilled in him. The ranch wasn't just a piece of property. It was Jake's future. Everything he had ever worked for was tied to that land. But when Jake received the call from his lawyer, everything changed. He had been stationed overseas for the last 6 months, serving his country with the same dedication he had always put into his family's ranch. While his country needed him, his heart was always back at the ranch. Every night, he would look up at the stars, thinking about the wide open spaces of his land and the long days of work that awaited him when he returned. He had always trusted that everything was in good hands back home. His father had always said that the ranch was like a child. It needed attention, care, and protection. But Jake never imagined that the one thing he'd always trusted, his family's land, would be taken from him without his knowledge. It was early in the morning when his phone buzzed. The familiar name of his lawyer, Frank, appeared on the screen. Jake didn't think much of it at first. He had been busy with work, but a quick conversation wouldn't hurt. He answered the phone, trying to sound casual. "Hey Frank, what's up?" "Jake, we need to talk." Frank's voice was tight, and there was an edge to it that immediately caught Jake's attention. "It's about your ranch." Jake sat up in his bed, his heart beginning to race. "What's wrong? Is everything okay?" "No, Jake, everything is far from okay," Frank said, his voice filled with frustration. "The HOA, the Homeowners Association, they sold your land. They sold it while you were overseas. The paperwork is already done. The property is no longer yours." Jake felt his world tilt. His breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? They sold it? How? They can't do that. My land is not theirs to sell." His voice was shaking now, disbelief flooding through him. This couldn't be real. His family had owned that land for generations. No one had the right to take it from him. Frank paused before speaking again. "Jake, I wish I were making this up, but the HOA, the very people who are supposed to protect homeowners, took advantage of your absence. They sold your land without your knowledge, without your permission. And the worst part? The new owners are already in control. They've signed the deed. It's done." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. His mind spun. He could barely comprehend what he was hearing. He had trusted the HOA to protect his land, and now they had sold it. It wasn't just a piece of property to him. It was his heritage. His father had worked on that land for years, building it into something they could all be proud of. It was where Jake had grown up. It was where his future was supposed to be. "Who bought it?" Jake asked, his voice tight. "We don't know yet," Frank replied. "I'm looking into it. But we need to act fast. The new owners might already be making plans. You need to get back here as soon as possible." Jake didn't need any more convincing. The anger inside him was instantaneous. The shock of betrayal and the injustice of the situation overwhelmed him. His heart pounded as he stood up from the bed. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let his family's land be taken from him. He had to act, and fast. His first thought was his father. The ranch had meant everything to him, and Jake knew he would be devastated if he was still alive. His father had always said that the land was sacred, and no one could take it away without a fight. Jake was determined to honor that legacy. "I'll do whatever it takes," Jake said, his voice steady with determination. "I'm coming home. I'll fix this." "Jake, I know you're upset, but we need to be strategic," Frank said. "The HOA is a powerful organization, and the new owners won't just hand the land back. We need to make sure we have a solid legal case before we make a move. I understand, Jake replied, though he could feel the heat rising in his chest. He wasn't going to sit back and let them get away with this. I'll get back as soon as I can. Do whatever you need to do on your end. I want to fight for this. Jake hung up the phone, his mind racing. The thought of someone else living on his family's land, of strangers making decisions about the property he had worked on for so many years, made him sick. He couldn't let this stand. He wasn't just fighting for a piece of land. He was fighting for his family's legacy, for his future, for the future of the land that had been passed down for generations. Jake didn't waste any time. He called his commanding officer, explained the situation, and asked for permission to leave his post early. He couldn't afford to stay overseas any longer. His land was at risk, and he needed to be home to protect it. His commanding officer, understanding the gravity of the situation, gave his approval. Jake was on the next flight back to the States. The flight felt like an eternity. As Jake looked out the window at the clouds, he couldn't help but think about the ranch. What if the new owners had already started changing things? What if they had plans to build on the land or tear down the house? His mind raced with possibilities. But there was one thing Jake knew for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone destroy what his family had worked for. He was going to fight, no matter what it took. When he finally landed and made his way back to his hometown, Jake felt the weight of the situation settle over him. The ranch was just miles away, but it felt like a lifetime. The closer he got, the more the anxiety built in his chest. What would he find when he arrived? Was it already too late? But Jake knew one thing. He wasn't going to give up. He had worked too hard, fought too many battles, and now he was fighting for his future. As he pulled up to the gate of the ranch, he could see the familiar outline of the house in the distance. His heart ached. It was still there, his home, but it felt different now, as if something had been taken from him. He walked toward the house, his mind swirling with anger and determination. The fight wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. Jake couldn't believe what had just happened. The feeling of betrayal lingered like a dark cloud over him as he stood in his driveway, staring at the ranch that had been his family's pride for generations. It wasn't just land to him. It was everything. Every fence, every barn, every tree had a story. His father's hard work, his sweat, his late nights, everything had been invested into that ranch. And now, without warning, the HOA had taken it all away. It was as if someone had ripped his heart out, and Jake wasn't ready to let go without a fight. His first step was clear. He had to find out exactly what had happened. He couldn't just sit around and wait for things to sort themselves out. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Jake spent the next few days combing through all the paperwork he could find. He reached out to his lawyer, Frank, who had already begun digging into the details. Jake had to understand how the HOA had managed to sell his land without his knowledge. Frank had been working around the clock to uncover the truth, but Jake knew the HOA wasn't going to hand over the answers easily. "Jake, I've been looking into this," Frank said one evening over the phone. "I found some strange things. The paperwork for the sale is all in order, but there's no record of your consent. The HOA must have pulled some strings." "How could they do that?" Jake asked, pacing back and forth in his living room. "My signature was forged, wasn't it?" Frank paused before answering. "It's not that simple. It looks like they didn't need your signature. They took advantage of a legal loophole. You were absent, and the HOA used that against you. They listed the property as abandoned and, under the terms of their bylaws, they were able to sell it without informing you." Jake felt his blood boil. "So, they sold my land because I wasn't around? That's absurd." "Unfortunately, Jake, it's all legal on their end," Frank replied. "But the good news is that we've got a solid case. The HOA has overstepped. What they did may be legal on paper, but morally, it's a different story. We've got a chance to challenge this, especially with your military service involved. The law sees that as a major factor." Jake was still furious, but the thought of having the military on his side gave him a sense of hope. He wasn't just a civilian in this fight. He had the backing of the army, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Frank continued, "The new owners are another issue. We don't know who they are yet, but we're working on it. We'll find out, Jake. This won't be easy, but it's not impossible." That was the moment Jake made his decision. He wasn't going to let the HOA get away with this, and he wasn't going to let the new owners take what belonged to him. Jake knew what he had to do. He would use every resource he had to fight back. He couldn't do it alone, though. He needed allies. He needed information. Jake spent the following week visiting his neighbors, talking to anyone who might have information about the sale or the new owners. He even reached out to Carl, his neighbor who had been living on the property next door for years. Carl had always been a quiet, reserved man, someone who kept to himself. But Jake knew that Carl had seen things and knew things that could help him. "Jake, I know you've been busy with the military and everything, but I've been keeping an eye on things," Carl said when they met one afternoon. "I've heard some things about the HOA, and I don't like what I'm hearing." "What do you mean?" Jake asked, leaning in closer. Carl glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "I've seen Karen meeting with people, developers mostly. I don't know all the details, but it looks like she's been making deals behind closed doors. Selling property, moving land around, making money off people who don't even know what's going on." Jake's heart sank. "So this wasn't just about my land. This is part of a bigger scheme." Carl nodded. "That's what it looks like. I'm not the only one who's noticed. I've talked to a few other neighbors, and they're all getting the same feeling. People are starting to wake up to what Karen's been doing, but it's going to be a fight to get anyone to speak up. She's got too much control." Jake was furious but also determined. "We have to do something. I'm not going to let her keep doing this to people. I'll fight for the ranch, but I'm not stopping there. I'll expose everything she's been doing." "It's not going to be easy," Carl warned. "Karen doesn't just have power in the HOA. She's got power in the community. People are scared of her, and she's got a lot of influence." Jake looked Carl square in the eye. "Then it's time we fight back. She's taken my land, but I'm taking it all back. I'm not going to let her ruin more lives. We've got to expose what she's doing. We've got to show people the truth." Carl nodded. "I'll help you, Jake. You're not alone in this." With Carl's support and the information he had gathered, Jake felt a new sense of hope. The more he learned, the more it became clear that Karen wasn't just targeting him. She was targeting the entire neighborhood, manipulating people for her own gain. Jake wasn't just fighting for his ranch anymore. He was fighting for the future of his community. Over the next few days, Jake gathered all the evidence he could. He spoke to more neighbors, piecing together the puzzle of Karen's corruption. The more they uncovered, the angrier Jake became. Karen had been using her position as HOA president to bully people, steal property, and line her own pockets. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a pattern of abuse. Jake was no longer fighting for just a piece of land. He was fighting to bring down a system of corruption that had been allowed to flourish for too long. The stakes had just gotten higher. With Frank's help, they filed the legal documents needed to begin the formal process of reclaiming the ranch. The legal battle was just starting, but Jake had a new fire inside him. He wasn't going to back down. Karen and the HOA had no idea what was coming their way. This was his land, and no matter what it took, he would get it back. The fight had only just begun. Jake knew that this was bigger than a simple legal battle. His family's land was his heritage, his future, and he wasn't about to let someone take it away without a fight. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. The HOA, under Karen's direction, had sold his family's legacy without so much as a second thought. He couldn't let that stand. But Jake knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight. The HOA had power, resources, and the backing of the developers who had bought his ranch. They weren't going to back down quietly. But Jake had something they didn't, a deep connection to the military, and he was ready to use it to his advantage. The military had always been there for him, supporting him through every challenge he had faced. It wasn't just about being an officer. It was about the camaraderie, the strength that came from being part of something larger than himself. It was time to call in those favors, time to call in the people who owed him, people who could help him take this fight to the next level. Jake pulled out his phone and dialed the number of his commanding officer, Colonel Roberts. The phone rang twice before it clicked. "Jake, what's going on?" Colonel Roberts' voice came through, calm and steady as always. "You don't usually call me like this unless something serious is up." Jake took a deep breath. He didn't have time to sugarcoat things. "Colonel, I need your help. The HOA, the people who are supposed to serve and protect the community, they sold my family's land while I was overseas. They've taken what's mine, and I need to get it back." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Jake could almost feel the weight of Colonel Roberts' thoughts. He wasn't someone to jump into things without assessing the situation first, but Jake had worked with him long enough to know that he wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. "I'm listening," the colonel said. "What do you need?" Jake didn't hesitate. "I need military support, Colonel. I need leverage. The HOA thinks they can get away with this. They've been using their power to bully people in the community, and I can't let them get away with it. I need your help to put pressure on them. The Army's backing could be just the thing to turn the tide." Colonel Roberts didn't hesitate for a second. "You've got my word, Jake. I'll make a few calls, reach out to the right people. We'll get this moving. I know what that land means to you, and I'll make sure Karen and the HOA know they've messed with the wrong person. You've always done your duty for the country, and now we'll do ours for you." Jake felt a surge of relief wash over him. Having the Army behind him wasn't just a formality, it was a game changer. He knew the HOA wasn't going to back down easily, but with the military on his side, the odds had just shifted. "Thank you, sir," Jake said, the gratitude evident in his voice. "I'll get back to you as soon as I have more information. I'm ready to fight." "And we'll be ready with you," Colonel Roberts replied. "You just make sure you keep your head in the game. We've got your back, Jake." As Jake hung up the phone, he felt a new sense of determination. He wasn't alone in this fight. The Army had his back, and with their help, he was going to take the fight to the HOA. He couldn't waste any more time. He had to move quickly. Over the next few days, Jake kept working with Frank, his lawyer, to build a case against the HOA. They began gathering more evidence, old documents, emails, and any other proof they could find that would show the HOA had violated Jake's rights. It was a slow process, but with Frank's expertise, they started to uncover more troubling details. They learned that Karen had been involved in multiple shady deals, and the illegal sale of Jake's ranch wasn't an isolated incident. The HOA had been using their influence to manipulate homeowners, selling land and property for profit, all while lining their pockets. It wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had been running for years. But Jake knew they couldn't take this battle to court alone. He needed the support of the community. He needed to show people what Karen had been doing behind their backs. He began speaking to his neighbors, starting with Carl, the man who had tipped him off to Karen's secret meetings. "Carl, I've been digging into this, and it's worse than I thought," Jake said one evening, sitting down on the porch with his neighbor. "Karen and the HOA have been taking advantage of people for years, selling properties without their consent, stealing from the community. We need to expose her, and we need to do it fast." Carl nodded, his face grim. "I know, Jake. I've seen it happen to other people. But people are afraid to speak up. Karen's got a lot of influence, and she's been using it to keep everyone quiet. She's bullied people into submission for years." Jake's fists clenched as he thought about the power Karen had wielded over the neighborhood, the fear she had instilled in so many. But now, Jake had something she didn't. He had the truth, and he had the Army behind him. "We're not going to be afraid anymore, Carl. This is our chance to stand up to her. I've got the military backing me, and with your help and the support of the others, we'll expose her for what she is." Carl looked at Jake, his face softening. "You're right, Jake. We've been too quiet for too long. It's time to fight back." Jake smiled, feeling the weight of his decision lighten. The Army, the community, the truth, all of it was on his side. He wasn't going to back down. With Frank's legal team working to build the case, Jake started putting more pressure on Karen. Every call he made, every document he sent, brought him closer to his goal. But Karen wasn't just going to roll over. She had her own plans to fight back, and Jake knew the war was far from over. The more the army pushed, the more Karen retaliated. She began using every trick in the book, spreading lies, making threats, and trying to turn the community against Jake. But this time, Jake wasn't going to be intimidated. The army had his back, and he wasn't backing down. He had a mission to complete, and nothing was going to stop him from reclaiming his family's land. Jake wasn't a man who backed down from a fight, but the battle against Karen and the HOA was unlike anything he had ever faced before. With the army's support and Frank's legal expertise, he felt he had a fighting chance, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. The HOA had power, money, and connections, and they weren't about to let go of the land they had sold without a fight. Jake could feel the weight of the situation settling over him as he prepared for the next steps. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was personal. Karen had not only taken his property but had played a dangerous game with people's lives, and Jake wasn't about to let her win. The days following the initial filing were filled with meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. Frank was hard at work, sifting through paperwork, gathering evidence, and preparing the case. Jake spent his time reaching out to more of his neighbors, talking to people who had been affected by Karen's manipulation. The more Jake learned, the angrier he became. It wasn't just the land. It was the way Karen had bullied, lied, and intimidated people for years. She had used her position to control the neighborhood, selling properties without permission, taking advantage of homeowners who were too afraid to speak up. But Jake was ready to expose it all. One afternoon, as Jake sat in Frank's office, going over the details of the case, the phone rang. It was a number Jake didn't recognize. He answered with a sense of unease, unsure of what to expect. "Jake!" The voice on the other end was low, almost whispering. It was a woman's voice. "I'm Maria from the HOA. I know what you're doing, and you need to stop now." Jake's heart raced. He had heard rumors of people from within the HOA trying to intimidate him, but hearing it firsthand was different. "I'm not going to stop, Maria," Jake said firmly. "What Karen and the HOA did is illegal. I'm getting my land back, and I'm going to make sure she's held accountable for everything she's done." There was a long pause on the other end, and Jake could hear faint voices in the background. "You don't understand, Jake. Karen has connections you can't even imagine. She's not someone you want to make an enemy of." "I don't care about her connections," Jake replied, his voice steady. "I'm not backing down. You should tell her that, because I'm coming for her, and I won't stop until she pays for what she's done." Maria didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice had lost its previous threat. "I don't know what you think you can do, but you won't win. We'll fight back every step of the way. You've been warned." With that, she hung up. Jake sat there for a moment, letting her words sink in. The HOA was already trying to intimidate him, but it didn't matter. Jake had seen worse during his time in the military. He had fought in battles that seemed impossible to win, and he had come out on top. He wasn't about to let Karen or anyone else stop him from taking back what was rightfully his. Frank looked up from his paperwork, sensing the tension in the room. "Who was that?" he asked. "Someone from the HOA," Jake said, his tone sharp. "They're trying to intimidate me into backing down. But it's not going to work. We need to hit them hard, Frank. We can't let them get away with this." Frank nodded. "I figured they'd try something like that. But we've got the law on our side, Jake. And we've got the army's backing. You just need to stay focused. We're going to expose them." Jake stood up, his mind already working through the next steps. "I'm not going to wait for this to drag on in the courts. I'm going to make sure the public knows what's going on. We need to shine a light on Karen and the HOA. People need to see what they've done." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jake, Frank, and the team of military advisors worked tirelessly to build a case. They pulled together more evidence of the HOA's illegal actions, including witness testimonies, records of unauthorized sales, and emails that showed Karen's involvement in the corruption. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about the ranch. It was about exposing a system of power and greed that had been allowed to run unchecked for years. Jake wasn't the only one who was determined to fight back. As word of the case spread, more neighbors started to speak out. They were tired of Karen's manipulation, tired of living in fear of the HOA's power. The more people spoke up, the stronger Jake's case became. It was clear that Karen's hold on the community was slipping, and Jake wasn't going to let up. But Karen wasn't done yet. As the legal battle intensified, Jake started to receive more threats, anonymous phone calls, mysterious figures lurking around his property, and even direct confrontations with people who had been paid off by the HOA to intimidate him. But each time Jake faced one of these threats, he grew stronger. He had the army on his side, and now, he had the full support of the community behind him. Karen's intimidation tactics were losing their power. One day, Jake got a call from Colonel Roberts. "Jake, I've got something that could really help you," the colonel said, his voice low but urgent. "We've been doing some digging, and it turns out Karen isn't just connected to the HOA. She's involved in some other shady business deals. We've got records of her using her position to profit from land sales and development projects. This is bigger than just your ranch." Jake's heart raced with excitement. "You're telling me Karen has been involved in more than just selling my land?" "Exactly," the colonel replied. "We've got enough evidence to bring her down, Jake. But we need to move fast. If we can get this out to the public, we'll expose her once and for all." Jake didn't waste a second. He knew this was the break he'd been waiting for. With the army's help, they began to put together a plan to expose Karen and the HOA's corruption to the public. They contacted reporters, gathered witnesses, and prepared to bring everything to light. As the days passed, the pressure on Karen and the HOA grew. People in the community began to rally behind Jake, speaking out against the corruption that had held them captive for so long. Karen tried to keep the situation under control, but it was clear that her grip was slipping. The battle for Jake's land wasn't just about reclaiming what was his. It was about bringing justice to an entire community that had been manipulated and exploited. Jake stood at the edge of his property, looking out over the land he had worked so hard to protect. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he had the upper hand. With the army's support, the community behind him, and the truth on his side, Jake knew he was on the path to victory. The tension had been building for weeks, and Jake knew the time to act had arrived. He had spent every waking moment preparing for this moment. The moment when Karen and the HOA would no longer be able to hide behind their lies. The battle had been long, and the stakes were high, but Jake was ready to bring everything into the light. The weight of the situation wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about his ranch anymore. It was about exposing a system of greed, manipulation, and corruption that had been running unchecked for far too long. Karen and the HOA had stolen his land, but in doing so, they had unknowingly exposed their own crooked dealings, and Jake was going to make sure they paid for it. Jake and Frank had gathered mountains of evidence over the past few weeks: emails, signed documents, even testimonies from former members of the HOA who had grown disillusioned with Karen's tactics. But it wasn't enough just to have the evidence. They needed to make sure the public saw it. They needed to expose Karen for who she truly was: a power-hungry leader who had used her position to exploit homeowners and line her own pockets. The first step was to go public with the truth. Jake and Frank knew that the local media was key to spreading the word. Jake had already contacted a few reporters who were willing to take on the story, but he knew they needed to hit hard. They couldn't just release a statement. They needed to expose everything: Karen's shady dealings, the illegal sale of his land, and the systemic corruption that had been going on under the HOA's nose. "Jake, we've got everything we need," Frank said one morning as they sat down in the conference room. "I've spoken with the reporters, and they're ready to run the story. We've got enough evidence to make a serious impact. This is the moment we've been waiting for." Jake nodded, but his nerves were starting to show. This was a big risk. If Karen and the HOA managed to fight back, they could drag this out even longer, making it harder for Jake to reclaim his land. But Jake wasn't thinking about the risk anymore. He was thinking about how much his father had worked to build that ranch, how much he had put into it. This fight was more than about land. It was about standing up for what was right, for every person who had been wronged by Karen and the HOA. "I'm ready, Frank," Jake said, his voice steady. "Let's do this. It's time everyone knew the truth." The plan was set into motion that afternoon. Jake and Frank worked with the reporters to draft a detailed article, outlining every detail of the illegal sale, the manipulation by Karen, and the ways the HOA had been taking advantage of homeowners. They made sure to include every piece of evidence they had collected. It was a full expose, one that would send shockwaves through the community. Jake couldn't wait any longer. He knew that once the article was published, there would be no going back. The battle was going public, and the HOA wouldn't be able to escape the fallout. As the hours passed, Jake could feel the weight of the moment growing heavier. He was in the middle of the most important fight of his life, and he had no intention of losing. He walked through the house, glancing at the ranch that had been his family's for generations. His mind was still racing, but he had one thing on his side: he wasn't fighting alone. The support from his neighbors and the community had been overwhelming, and now, with the evidence ready to be exposed, Karen and the HOA were about to face the consequences of their actions. Later that evening, Jake received a call from one of the reporters. "Jake, it's done. The stories live. We've published everything, the emails, the documents, the testimonies. We've made sure the whole truth is out there for everyone to see." Jake felt a rush of adrenaline. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to feel. This was it. There was no turning back now. He was about to take on Karen and the HOA in front of the entire community. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice low but grateful. "You've done a good job." As the next few hours passed, Jake noticed the change in the air. The first few reactions came in quick. Neighbors, people from the community, and even people who had been too afraid to speak out before were now posting about the story on social media. The local news picked up the story, and soon, everyone knew about Karen's corrupt dealings with the HOA. People were angry, but they were also grateful to Jake for standing up to the system that had controlled them for so long. Jake watched as the public reaction grew. The community began to rally behind him. The more people spoke out, the more Karen's power began to crumble. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak now started coming forward, sharing their own experiences with the HOA and Karen's manipulation. But Karen wasn't taking this lying down. She quickly called an emergency HOA meeting, but the tide had already turned. Her attempts to rally the community against Jake only fueled the fire. She tried to paint him as the villain, claiming he was a troublemaker who didn't respect the community's rules. But it was too late. The public knew the truth now, and Karen's lies were no longer believable. Jake watched from the sidelines as Karen tried to salvage what was left of her reputation. She made desperate phone calls, tried to intimidate the developers who had bought his land, but it was clear that the walls were closing in on her. The more she fought back, the more she exposed her true character. The public saw her for what she really was, a power-hungry, corrupt individual who had abused her position for years. As the story continued to spread, Jake felt a sense of relief. This was it. The truth was out. He had done everything he could to bring Karen and the HOA down, and now the community was waking up. They weren't going to let her control them anymore. The fight for his ranch was far from over, but Jake knew that the hardest part was behind him. The battle to reclaim his family's legacy had shifted in his favor. But the fight wasn't just about his land. It was about standing up for what was right. Jake wasn't just taking on Karen. He was taking on an entire system that had exploited people for years. And the truth, he knew, would always win in the end. The court date had arrived. After months of legal battles, threats, and emotional strain, Jake was finally standing at the edge of the most crucial moment of his life. The previous weeks had felt like a whirlwind, an exhausting, nerve-wracking journey through countless legal hurdles and community conflict. But now, everything had come down to this: the courtroom, the judge, and the final chance to reclaim his family's land. Jake had spent countless hours preparing, not just with Frank, his lawyer, but with the support of the entire community. Neighbors who had once feared Karen's power were now standing with him. People who had been too intimidated to speak out were now sharing their stories, rallying behind him. This wasn't just about his ranch anymore. It was about exposing the corruption that had taken hold of the neighborhood for years. It was about standing up to a system that had tried to push people like Jake aside. As Jake entered the courthouse, his stomach tightened with anticipation. He was used to high-stress situations, but this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was about justice. The echoes of his father's voice, urging him to always do what's right, rang in his mind. His father had built this ranch with his own hands, and now Jake was going to fight to keep it. There would be no backing down. Jake looked around the courtroom as he took his seat. He noticed Karen sitting at the other end, her cold eyes focused on the proceedings. She looked confident, almost smug, as if she already knew how the case would end. But Jake knew something she didn't. He had the truth on his side. The tide had turned in his favor, and Karen's manipulative tactics were no longer going to work. She was cornered. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The case had finally reached the courtroom, and this was where everything would be decided. Frank gave Jake a reassuring nod, signaling that it was time to begin. The battle for his land was about to enter its final phase. Frank stood up first, addressing the judge. "Your Honor, we stand here today not just to reclaim property, but to seek justice. The defendant, the HOA, and their president, Karen, have illegally sold my client's land without his consent, without his knowledge. They manipulated legal loopholes and took advantage of his absence while he was serving overseas. This is not just a simple mistake, it is a calculated betrayal." Jake's heart beat faster as Frank laid out the case, piece by piece. The evidence they had gathered, the fraudulent paperwork, the witness testimonies, and the undeniable proof of Karen's shady dealings, was all laid out for the judge to see. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that Jake's case was solid. Frank wasn't just arguing for Jake's right to his property. He was arguing for justice, for the community that had been victimized by the HOA's corruption. When it was Karen's turn to speak, Jake could see the tension in her eyes. Her confidence had faded, replaced by a hint of desperation. She stood up, adjusting her blazer and straightening her back. "Your Honor, my actions were in line with the HOA's bylaws. We were simply following procedure. The land was abandoned, and as the HOA president, I had a duty to ensure that the property was managed properly," Karen said, her voice wavering slightly. Jake could hear the lies in her words. She had no defense. She had manipulated the system, used her power to sell his family's land, and now she was trying to twist the truth to save herself. But it was too late. The evidence was clear, and the community had spoken. Karen could no longer hide behind her false pretenses. After what felt like hours of legal arguments, the judge finally called for a recess. Jake stepped out of the courtroom, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't over yet, but he could feel the momentum shifting in his favor. The judge had listened carefully, and now it was just a matter of time before the decision was made. As Jake walked down the courthouse steps, he was greeted by a wave of support from his neighbors, friends, and even a few local reporters who had been covering the case. "Jake, we're behind you all the way," Carl said, patting him on the back. "You've done something none of us thought was possible." Jake smiled, but his mind was still on the case. The real work was still ahead. The judge's ruling could go either way, and until that gavel came down, the fight wasn't over. Hours later, the court reconvened. The atmosphere in the room was tense, everyone waiting for the judge's final decision. Karen was still sitting in her seat, her posture rigid and tense. Jake stood tall, his back straight, prepared for whatever was to come. Frank gave him one last look of encouragement before the judge spoke. After reviewing the evidence presented by both parties, it is clear that the HOA's actions were not only a violation of property rights but also an abuse of power. The sale of Mr. Jake's property was conducted under fraudulent pretenses, and as such, I am ordering that the sale be reversed. The property will be returned to Mr. Jake, and all subsequent agreements made with the new owners are hereby null and void. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had won. The ranch was his again. The weight that had been bearing down on him for so long lifted, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe. The victory wasn't just his. It was a victory for everyone in the community who had suffered under Karen's control. The truth had prevailed, and Karen's reign of power was officially over. As the courtroom erupted into whispers, Jake felt the eyes of his neighbors on him. They had stood by him through the hardest of times, and now they were witnessing the fruits of their collective struggle. Karen stood up, her face flushed with anger, but there was no more fight left in her. She had lost. "This isn't over," she muttered, glaring at Jake. Jake didn't flinch. He had won. He had taken back what was his, and in doing so, he had exposed the corruption that had been lurking in the HOA for years. Karen's threats and intimidation had lost their power. The battle was over, and Jake had won. As Jake stepped outside the courthouse, the weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders. The land was his again, and with it, his future. He had fought for his family's legacy, and he had won. There would be challenges ahead. Karen might try to retaliate, but Jake wasn't worried. He had the truth on his side, and with the support of his community and the strength of his military background, he knew that no one could take his family's land away again. The journey had been long, but the victory was sweet. Jake had taken on the system, fought back against the corruption, and come out on top. The ranch was his again, and the community was finally free from the HOA's grip. Jake knew that from this point forward, everything would be different. The fight had changed him, but it had also changed the community for the better. Jake stood tall as he looked out at the land, the ranch he had fought for, the legacy his father had built. It was his again, and this time, no one would ever take it from him. The battle was over, but the future was just beginning.